Hello and welcome to the programme. First, the British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine. Speaking to the BBC, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the operation had in some senses already begun, and it could end up being the largest conflict on European soil in more than 70 years. Here's our political correspondent, Damian Grammaticus.
In eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian Interior Minister and journalists accompanying him forced to run for cover. Their convoy had come under shell fire close to areas controlled by the Russian-backed separatists. Ukraine says these are Russia's attempts to provoke it to strike back and provide a pretext for war, and Boris Johnson agrees. Meeting Western leaders in Munich yesterday, he said the attacks are a sign President Putin's plan for an invasion is already being put into effect. In Munich, in an interview with the BBC's Sophie Rayworth, he warned of what's to come.
I'm afraid to say that the plan that we're seeing is for something that could be really the biggest war in Europe since 1945, just in terms of sheer scale. I think people need to understand the sheer cost in human life that could entail, not just for Ukrainians, but also for Russians and for young Russians.
Ukraine's president told the gathering the time for appeasing Russia was over.
For 8 years, Ukraine has been a shield. For 8 years, Ukraine has been holding back one of the greatest armies in the world, which stands along our borders, not the borders of the European Union.
But should Russia move to destroy Ukraine and its democracy, Boris Johnson gave his strongest warning yet of sanctions to come.
Not just hitting the associates of Vladimir Putin, but also all companies, organizations of strategic importance to Russia. We're going to stop Russian companies raising money on UK markets, and we're even with our American friends going to stop them trading in pounds and dollars. That will hit very, very hard.
So Ukraine waits and watches. Mr. Johnson warned a lightning Russian war might initially overwhelm these defences. But the West, he said, could not tolerate the destruction of a democracy and would, even if it took time, ensure such aggression did not pay off. Damian Grammaticus, BBC News.
Meanwhile, just north of Ukraine, Russia and Belarus have been holding 10 days of joint military exercises, which are due to come to an end on Sunday. Questions are now being asked about whether Russia will withdraw its troops and equipment or leave them stationed on Belarusian soil. Our correspondent, Steve Rosenberg, is in Belarus, and a warning: this report contains flash photography.
Definition of muscle flexing? This. A 100 miles from Ukraine's border, Russia and Belarus are holding joint exercises on an unprecedented scale. NATO says it's the biggest deployment of Russian troops in Belarus since the Cold War. At least 10,000 Russian soldiers within easy reach of Ukraine. But both Moscow and Minsk deny they're threatening anyone.
Our country isn't helping Russia to capture Ukraine, and Russia doesn't want to capture Ukraine. We don't need war in Belarus or in Russia. We've had enough war. We still remember World War II.
Russia insists that these exercises are purely defensive. Ukraine says this is psychological pressure at the very least. And at most, well, there is concern in Kiev and in the West that if there is a full-scale attack on Ukraine, then Russian troops in Belarus could be part of that. America seems to think so.
For months now, Russia has been building up its military forces in and around Ukraine, including in Belarus. They are uncoiling and are now poised to strike.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, "You may begin," Vladimir Putin told army chiefs. And they began. The president oversaw drills by Russia's strategic nuclear forces, showing off his country's state-of-the-art missiles. A message, perhaps, to Russia's rivals, and not a subtle one, that for now at least, the Kremlin is in no mood to compromise. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Minsk.
Well, earlier I spoke to our Kiev correspondent, James Waterhouse, and he told me how people there have been reacting to the threat of possible war.
It's feeding into the concern felt by many Ukrainians. There is, as ever, there's peace in Kiev at the moment, but day-to-day life is getting more tricky for Ukrainians. We speak to them, they are worried. Yes, some are choosing to move to more western parts of the country, but it's still very much an unknown, despite all this Western intelligence, Western claims that the invasion could take many forms as these troops, these all up 190,000 troops, including the Russian-backed militants, if they were to advance from the north and encircle the capital or come in from the east. So that's done nothing to relax concerns. The diplomatic efforts are continuing in a sense. President Macron is expected to have a phone call with Vladimir Putin today, but in the words of his own officials, this is seen as one final effort to put him off invading.
And what are the possible options here for de-escalation?
Well, you have to go back to Russia's red lines and what Ukraine is willing to do. Russia wants NATO to publicly say that Ukraine will never join the alliance. It also wants NATO to scale back. NATO's made it clear all the way through that it's not willing to do that. It's increased its presence in the east of Europe, and it said it's up for individual countries to make their choice. The second option, which is being pushed by both Russia and the West, is to get Ukraine and Moscow to engage in what's called the Minsk agreements, these until now failed peace process in those occupied territories in the east of the country. For Ukraine to regain control and secure the border, it has to put in a number of conditions, including immunity from prosecution, a prisoner exchange, as well as hold local elections. Moscow says, OK, we'll agree to that as long as this territories get special status and that there are local elections. For President Zelensky here, that's very hard for him to agree to because he was elected on the basis he wouldn't make any concessions, and in their eyes it would give Russia an influence on the running of Ukraine, which a lot of people are very sensitive to.